Chapter 15. I traced Christine's trajectory as she ran through the backstage area below me. I saw her go into a stairwell leading upward, followed closely by Raoul. Driven by a sense of danger, I followed the both of them. The staircase came out on the roof. I exited through the door at the top of the staircase into the twilight gloom of a Parisian snowfall. Raoul and Christine huddled together for warmth in the middle of the wide-open roof space. I retreated into the shadows and made my way out of their line of sight behind a tall statue. I listened to them talk. Well, I should say, I listened to Christine try to talk through her hyperventilating and listened to the bewildered boy try to say something, anything, to calm her. His dismissive tone got on my nerves. He took the route of trying to convince Christine that she was crazy, and that all the weird things happening around her were mere coincidences, not the doing of any opera ghost. Finally, Christine calmed enough to be able to tell Raoul that I did exist, and she knew for a fact that I had committed the murder of the man whose body probably still at that moment hung twisting and swaying 10 feet above the stage. Raoul didn't seem to know what to make of the information. He gathered her into his arms and began to murmur calmingly into her ear. I watched them for a moment, then sniffled involuntarily. My nose had begun to run in the cold night. Christine raised her head from Raoul's shoulder and looked around the rooftop in fright. I knew she had heard me. She pulled away from Raoul and stood with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to decide whether she wanted Raoul's love or my music more. Raoul reached out to bring her back to his embrace, and she hesitated. My heart leaped in my chest. She would deny him for the sake of the music I could bring to her. But then she opened her arms and rushed over to him. He pulled her close and clutched her to himself as if she were some priceless item he'd saved from a house fire. My heart broke nearly in two. I had given this girl a world of music, and this was the thanks I received. I quite forgot that I had originally undertaken her training as an homage to her father. It had become so much more than that in my mind during our time together. I watched as they kissed. Jealousy consumed me. What wouldn't I give to be where he was? He broke the kiss and dropped to one knee before her. I could tell from the way she raised her hand to her mouth that he had just proposed marriage. He had no ring, but the question was enough. She nodded her head without hesitation, and he scrambled to his feet to throw his arms around her once more. She suddenly remembered that she had a show to star in several stories beneath her feet. She and Raoul ran back to the staircase door, making plans to meet later. I left the rooftop after them in a daze. It seemed I had lost her. Lost her to a man who cared nothing about the music that I knew moved her soul as it did mine. My very being rebelled against this latest turn of events. I had already lost one woman to a man who did not appreciate her, a man who could not bring her joy as I could. I would be damned if I lost another. I strode down the staircase all the way to the 5th cellar. I pulled across the lake and let the water gate drop down behind me. I had work to do. I nervously adjusted my mask and checked for the umpteenth time that I still carried my precious cargo. I wasn't wearing one of my usual masks tonight. Instead, I wore a skull-shaped mask that coordinated with my broad red hat and cloak and skull-headed staff to make a costume portraying Red Death. I honestly had no idea if Red Death was a legend or a character in an opera or even an old wives' tale. I only knew I had come across the costume labeled as such in the wardrobe department and felt it to be perfect for the level of intimidation I wanted to deliver tonight. I paused on my side of the door I was about to walk through. I could hear the roar of a good party going on the other side. Riotous music blared out from one of the galleries overlooking the scene. Participants in 100 conversations tried to make themselves heard above the melodies. I knew that the staircase in the main foyer of the opera would be crowded with bodies moving to the beat of the music and trying to find the best place to display themselves in their costume. Tonight was the Opera Masked Ball, one of the most anticipated events of the entire year. It had been several months since I had witnessed that scene on the roof. I saw Christine sometimes, but she did not wear a ring on her finger yet. It wasn't until I saw her with Raoul again one day that I realized the truth. She conversed with him, and her face shone with adoration as she gazed at him. He seemed to ask her a question, and she nodded and pulled a chain out of the bodice of her dress. Dangling from the chain was a ring with a sparkling diamond on it. She looked around her nervously, then dropped the ring back down the front of her dress. Raoul looked displeased, but there was little he could do. The chain looped around the back of her neck and then disappeared below her neckline. That was all the indication she gave that she was spoken for. I felt angry that she was duplicitous enough to try to hide it from me. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I had checked that my recent modifications to the opera foyer were working, twice. Hesitation at this point was useless. I slammed the double doors in front of me open. The impact of the left-hand door upon the wall behind it, or rather, the impact of the small razor blade I'd embedded in the top portion of the door, sliced the filament that ran invisibly up the wall of the grand foyer. The tension on this line disappeared, and the curtain it had been supporting at the ceiling dropped abruptly down directly in front of the musicians in their gallery. The music in the foyer stopped, with several assorted squawks caused by startled musicians. The bang of the doors I had just entered, coupled with the cessation of the music, caused all heads to turn toward me as one. A wave of silence rippled out from where I stood as conversations came to a screeching halt, their participants finding me far more interesting to observe. Even the most loquacious patrons, though they tried valiantly to finish their thoughts, trailed away into silence as their gazes found me. I took 3 deliberate steps forward, down the stairs. Good evening, everyone. I'm here to deliver you your next production. It's an opera that I wrote. I tossed the score I held to Monsieur Andre, who was closest to me. I really do suggest that you comply. 1 murder is quite enough for any opera house, don't you think? I looked around at the faces that stared at me. Their expressions ranged from fear to anger to fascination. I noticed movement at the back of the crowd. It was Raoul sidling out the door at the back. Coward, I thought. Oh, and there are some things you need to get in order before presenting this. 1. Carlotta has the silent role this time. 2. Whoever sings the male lead needs to be slim, not like the buffoon we have now. I gestured at Piangi, the leading bass, who had to be at least 40 pounds heavier than I was. I could see he was insulted, both at the comment about his weight and at the very idea that he would not be taking the lead role. 3. Christine Daae gets the lead soprano role. No arguments, no understudies. She can return to me, her teacher, if she feels unequal to the task. I stared Christine in the eye as I said this. She looked back at me, gave no indication that she would comply with my instructions. I moved closer to her where she stood and circled around behind her. I really do think you should return to our lessons, my dear, I whispered, just loud enough for her to hear me. Don't you remember how good our music is together? I sensed her tense up as I appealed to her. I circled back around to her front, but she refused to meet my eyes. Angered, I put my hand to her cleavage and grabbed the chain that I knew held her engagement ring. I yanked briskly on the chain, causing it to snap and Christine to stumble forward. She instinctively grabbed for my shoulder to steady herself, but I stepped back quickly, making her have to regain her balance on her own. It would not do for her to demonstrate to the fascinated crowd that I could be touched, not when half of them still clearly believed I was a supernatural apparition. An angry red welt appeared on the sides of her neck, where the metal had dug into her skin. I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, Your chains are mine. You will sing my music, for me alone. I stuffed the ring into my pocket. She turned and ran into the crowd. I whirled and strode to the center of the vast room. I looked around at the assembly of people still staring at me as I groped for the minuscule divot in the marble floor with the tip of my staff. I found it and pressed down into it with a pointed tip, while with the other hand I dropped some smoke bombs I had purloined from the props department. The staff triggered the catch of the trapdoor I'd built, while the clouds of smoke obscured me as I disappeared. The trapdoor gave way beneath me where I stood and dropped me into a net I'd strung below the opening. I curled myself into a ball as I fell, not wanting my feet to tear through the net and strike the floor below. The trapdoor swung back up on a spring and blended back into the marble floor of the foyer. I knew the trapdoor might be discovered as people crowded close to inspect the spot where I had vanished, but I was confident no one would find the catch that made it work. I lay on my back in the net for a moment or two, watching to make sure the trapdoor sealed itself, but mostly just enjoying the pounding of my heart in my ears. I'd tested that escape a dozen times in the dead of night, and I immensely enjoyed the thrill of plummeting through the floor to land in perfect safety. Flummoxing everyone who had watched me do it was only an added benefit. I knew I had only moments before I was discovered, so I fought my way out of the net and set off at a run back to my chambers. The company duly began rehearsals for my opera, Don Juan Triumphant, abandoning the production of Robert le Diable in half readiness. I excitedly spied on the first rehearsal involving the entire chorus. My excitement quickly changed to irritation, however, when I saw the dismissive way everyone was treating the music. I knew that the score did not have the polished, well-worn harmonies of a Mozart opera. There were several modern-sounding chords in the music that I knew would take hours of practice to get right as they were written. I had assumed that these people, being paid professionals, would not hesitate to take up the challenge and would seek to perfectly replicate what I had written. In that, I was severely disappointed. I left note after note of instructions for Reye. It got to the point where he would spend the rehearsal banging notes, which is chorus code for playing the notes over and over on the piano in hopes some of them stick in the singers' heads. Mention one or two things I had written in my letters, give no suggestions on how the singers might accomplish my directives, throw up his hands, and call an end to the rehearsal. The singers, for the most part, reacted to their director's apathy with similar distaste. Many of them didn't bother to pay attention during the rehearsals, spending the time gossiping with their section mates. I decided something had to be done. I grabbed the piano from the rehearsal room one night after everyone had left and rolled it away to where I had my tools laid out in a better lit space. It was an upright model, not a grand piano. I took off the front part of the cabinet above the keyboard and installed my new apparatus over the hammers. A piano works by using a felt-covered hammer to strike a steel string when a key is pressed. I had thought about how I would assist the chorus to take my music seriously, and had found inspiration in Miriam's music box. I had noticed how the turning spring powered a drum covered in little nubs that pulled on and then released a tuned piece of metal to make a note. With a little trial and error, I was able to reconfigure this whole process to work inside a piano. The nubs on the turning drum would press on the shaft that lifted the piano's hammer when the key was pressed. When the drum rotated away and released the shaft, the hammer would fall back to its position, striking the string just as if the key had been pressed. I had assembled the spring-loaded works into a wooden tray just the size of the top half of the piano front. Now I took apart the rehearsal piano upstairs, and the shallow wooden tray in which I had installed the spring-loaded mechanism became the new music rack that covered the top half of the front of the piano. I also installed a clockwork timed release switch on the spring that I had wound tight. I set it to allow the spring to unwind in 13 hours when rehearsal was due to start. Then I reconsidered and added 20 minutes to the timer. I knew that it normally only took them 20 minutes to begin arguing and bickering among themselves about the music, and I wanted my piano to start playing for them at the moment their emotions were highest. Satisfied with my night's work, I rolled the piano back to the rehearsal hall. I spied on the rehearsal the next day with malicious glee. I was not disappointed when the piano suddenly began to play. The ghostly notes spilled from the instrument just as they were in the throes of an argument about whether ghosts, such as I was rumored to be, actually existed. It could not have been more perfect. One by one, the music struck their ears, and they whirled toward the unattended piano. As one, they picked up their scores, found where the piano was playing their notes, and began to sing it. I watched their pale faces as my music spilled from their collective throats, and I felt overwhelming satisfaction. Now that the chorus was properly in line, I could turn my attention to the bigger problem. Christine was refusing to sing the leading role. I surmised that she had guessed her voice was a major cause of my attraction to her, and she feared to do anything that might increase her desirability to me. I racked my brain for anything I could do to convince or coerce her to sing the opera, but came up empty-handed. To my surprise, it was Raoul who accomplished my aims for me. He convinced her to sing so that I would attend to listen to her, thus allowing him to have the police capture and arrest me. André and Firmin agreed wholeheartedly with this plan and joined him in begging Christine to sing. I prayed she would listen to them. I needed this from her, and I feared no Parisian gendarme. Their incompetence was legendary. I needed her to be the lead soprano because the entire opera was in fact only a ploy to get myself beside her again. I was insisting that the lead male be slim so that I could step in for him and sing in his place beside Christine. The plot of the opera called for this character to be masked, so no one would notice my mask when I substituted myself in. The entire enterprise was a way for me to remind Christine of the joy she felt as we sang together. I wanted her to remember it, and then I would remind her that tone-deaf Raoul could never give this to her. She was not yet locked into a path of unhappiness in the same sense that Miriam, the harem girl, had been. I knew that it wasn't too late for Christine to change her choice and live a life with me, full of music and adoration. All she had to do was wrap her mind around the way I looked. I was fully willing to wear my mask every minute of the rest of my days if it would help her to be with me. As I planned out the moment in the opera when I would make my final plea into her ear, I couldn't help but think that it would be easier for me to speak and her to listen if she could not see me. After all, our relationship had been wonderful in the days before she had seen my face. My mind began to generate staging ideas for putting objects or screens between us at that moment, but I rejected them all, as I would not be able to hold her if I did that. It came to me one evening as I walked into my pitch-black bedchamber to drop into my bed. I would cause all the lights in the theater to go out. The newly upgraded electric stage lighting system would grant my wish and extinguish all the lights after a little persuasion on my part. I rigged up a new timer switch as I had done to the piano and installed it behind the main breaker for all the stage lighting. I knew that on opening night I could easily set the clockwork to release the tension on its spring at a certain time, which would physically push the handle of the breaker into the off position. I had one last element to my plan to cause widespread shock during my opera. I planned to punish the continued recalcitrance of André and Firmin. Not only were they far behind on my salary, but they persisted in ignoring my instructions. They had only allowed the production of my opera because Raoul de Chagny had seen an opportunity for vengeance and pressed them to take it. Far above the auditorium hung the magnificent crystal chandelier. 7 tons of brass and crystal reflected the light to every corner of the vast space. This, too, had been recently updated for electricity instead of gaslight, and electrical wires snaked down its heavy support chain to illuminate the bulbs housed within. I mounted to the attic of the opera house and studied the arrangements the electrical engineers had made. After comparing what I saw there with what I had read on the subject, I hit on a way to cause an unbelievable amount of chaos and not even have to take the blame for it. I walked over to the wrist-thick steel cable that suspended one of the counterweights used for raising and lowering the chandelier through the ceiling. Back when it had been a gaslight fixture, it had needed to be lit every time lighting was required. Instead of lowering the fixture all the way to the floor and fighting one's way in between the seats of the stalls to light it, the engineers of the day had rigged it to rise through the ceiling to the attic, where it could be lit in spacious leisure. Now, the raising system remained, but the need was gone, as electricity would light the new bulbs where they hung, suspended above the auditorium. 2 electrical wires were twisted around the raising/lowering cable, running down to the behemoth fixture below. As it was the early days of electricity, the wires were made of bare copper and had no shielding whatsoever. I experimented with a spare piece of cable I found lying in the attic, manipulating the wires with 2 pieces of wood. The tiny spark generated by touching 2 live electrical wires together would take about an hour to melt through a cable of that size. I would visit here just before the show and set the cable melting by generating a spark between the 2 wires. When it finally snapped, the counterweight holding the chandelier up would plummet through the ceiling, and the chandelier itself would sway menacingly, though the effect of the remaining counterweights would prevent the fixture from falling. This would be a very visual reminder that I, not Andre or Firmin, ruled this opera house. I made a mental note to instruct the box office not to seat any patrons directly below the counterweight. Satisfied, I left the attic, closing the door of the vast dusty space behind me.